I read The Canopy Keepers by Veronica G Henry. The Canopy Keepers is a fantasy about Syra, the main character, who is an older woman that is a firefighter in the Sequoia National Parks and falls into a magical world where there are creatures in the universe who are protecting nature from human influences, but they're not able to keep up with human technology. And so they're constantly having to try and save the environment, but also not willing to take the fight to humans, I guess. I think Syra's portrayal is very psychologically realistic. She comes off as a very traumatized person because of events that happen in her very early childhood, and then she's adopted by some wonderful people, but has a hard time accepting their love because she has repressed survivor's guilt. All of that stuff is pretty interesting. I really like that the story is constructed around such a troubled main character, and that trauma leads her to make selfish, short-sighted, prideful decisions that are not necessarily in her best interest all the time or the wisest choices for her to be making, but they feel very realistic as a counterpoint to this fantastical world where there are talking trees that have mycelial networks that give people and animals and plants superpowers, super strength, telepathy, the ability to repress fires, the ability to communicate over very long distances, things like that. And so when you have these really kind of fantastical elements in the story, to have these very realistic psychological elements, the contrast between those two things is really, really strong. Also, on the other side of the fantastical side, we find out that her brother, who she thought she lost at the beginning of the story, he was saved by these Canopy Keepers, which is what the book is named after. And they raised him the way that her adopted family raised her. And so they are two people of common origin who live in these two very different worlds and reunite. And those two very different worldviews come into conflict with each other, even though they both care a lot about the Sequoia National Forest and want to save it. The ways that they want to save it are very, very different. And the lengths that the main character is willing to go to are not as far as her brother, who is willing to kill all of the human beings in the area and in all of California, actually, as a message to stop harming the planet with the capitalism, basically. I find Syra's short-sightedness, pridefulness, difficulty frustrating at times when I was reading the book, but at the same time, I don't take my emotional response to be like a signal that is a shortcoming in the story. So I kind of ask myself, why do I feel this way? Why is the character doing these things? The author has made a choice to have her behave in these ways. And why is that happening? Because the author chose to have it happen. So I can choose to interpret that as a mistake, that this is bad writing. She doesn't understand how to write a sympathetic main character, or a main character who would make logical, quote unquote, choices about her life and be a quote unquote good hero and do things the right way. And then, take my uncomfortableness and say, well, the reason I'm uncomfortable is because I sense that this is a bad book, and that my uncomfortableness signals a failure in the book as a piece of art. But instead, I take it as an opportunity to learn something from the story that is like, why am I uncomfortable with a protagonist who behaves this way? Because there's a gap there for me to learn something about myself, for me to learn something that is a kind of new construction for a way that fantasy can be written from, this author's choice, Veronica Henry's choices. And so what I think is going on in the story is, like I said, it's very grounded in that PTSD, and the PTSD is not easily solved for Syra. She can't just pull herself out of it through quote unquote logical choices or like good career decisions or, like falling in love with the right person or whatever. And even when she encounters the fantastical elements in the world, that doesn't solve it for her either, which is really, really interesting, I think, because a lot of times in fantasy, that is the thing that will solve it for the character. But she's put in these really, really difficult positions dramatically where she has to choose between her family and like saving everyone in California, disappointing people, disappointing herself. And she makes really difficult choices. There's a real sense of, I think, moral realism in the story, that there are, even though there are many different perspectives on what is right and wrong, I think the story itself has a perspective that certain things are unambiguously morally evil or morally good, and that Syra's choice is kind of ratified by the story of trying to save everyone in California instead of choosing to be a quote unquote good daughter or good sister. There's a real choice here of you have to give up the identity that your family gives you to become who you really are, which I think would resonate with certain queer people in the world. Not that queerness is really a part of the story, but I think it's in the background there, or at least it was something that I was thinking about in fantasy fandom. There's a lot of queer folks who tune into the themes of fantasy, and for whatever reason, this author has chosen to make the dramatic choice here for Syra between her family identity and a personal identity that has to do with her vocation that is more than just a career, it's a calling. And in fact, she even throws away a career to pursue this calling. And at the same time, there's an interesting kind of like in the way background in the back of my mind was the kind of like Wizard of Oz question of like, how real is any of this? If you chose to interpret Syra's entire journey here as less spiritual and literal and more hallucinogenic and dreamlike, she could be falling into comfortable fantasies of a kind that allow her to insulate herself from her PTSD and pain and retreat from the failures of her identity in a career and family and all of those kind of things, and establish a new identity in a fantasy dreamlike reality where she has greater agency and importance, a kind of chosen oneness, the same way that in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy is extremely important. But on the farm in Kansas, she is an irrelevant child that no one respects, right? And so in the Oz world is not real, and it reflects a way that Dorothy needs to grow up and move beyond fantasy and take responsibility for her life. The story doesn't have that element to it really, but like I said, it was in the back of my mind as I was reading the whole thing that there's no parable to it. It literally is that Syra needs to move out of the quote unquote real world and step into the fantasy world in order to have a greater effect on saving the environment and combating the capitalist system that is destroying the world. This is part of a series. I've only read this book for the first time, so I don't know the context of the larger story or where it goes. And then I've only read it one time, so I'm not even sure that I totally understand everything that was happening in the story or the themes or ideas. I've never read any other of Veronica Henry's work, so I'm not familiar with her styles or themes or the context of the story in those ways. So probably eventually I will reread the book and move into the sequel book. I'm not sure how many of these books there are. It's called the Scorched Earth series. But yeah, I'll probably return to it and move through the wider series at some point in the future.